UFC 274 at the weekend had some incredible moments. I have never watched one of my favourite fighters get knocked out cold so many times as I have in the last week watching that Michael Chandler front kick. It's like listening to a really sad song. It hurts, but it's beautiful at the same time. However, it produced probably one of the worst fights I've ever seen in the co-main event. Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza. Carla Esparza obviously won the decision to become the new champion, and the fight was absolutely dreadful. There's a lot of factors at play, I think, as to why it was a terrible fight, but ultimately it came up with the discussion in my head about, was it the worst title fight that I've ever seen in the UFC? And instantly, recency bias is a real issue in MMA. It's definitely a thing, especially with fighters only fighting a couple of times a year, you know? But I really think it's up there. So I decided to put out a Twitter poll, which I did, and I put in there some other fights off the top of my head that stand up as some of the worst title fights in UFC history. And because I've not made a video in a while, I suppose as penance for my sins for not uploading, I made myself go back and watch all of these fights, including Namajunas versus Esparza for a second time, and decide which one really is the worst title fight in UFC history, and whether Namajunas versus Esparza is just recency bias or not. So let's go way back. We'll do these in chronological order. So we're going back to Abu Dhabi for this first one. So UFC 112 Invincible was the UFC's first show in Abu Dhabi, and because of that, they stacked the card of what they thought would be huge matchups that should deliver on a massive event for the UFC. I mean, it was in Yas Island. They had an arena built for the event. So you know the card had some big names on it. I went back and watched the whole card, and I was surprised when I came across Rafael dos Anjos versus Terry Etim, which I forgot had even happened. So that was fun. Matt Hughes versus Renzo Gracie was one of the fights on the card. It didn't deliver at all, but you know, big names on paper. And the co-main event saw Frankie Edgar upset everyone when he beat BJ Penn. It was a pretty dull fight, in fairness, but no one saw that one coming. Obviously it meant big things going further ahead, like down the line, but at the time it was not really a great result for the UFC, who BJ Penn was obviously one of their big stars, and for him to lose his belt in quite a dull fight to Frankie Edgar, who no one really gave a chance to, it didn't set the tone brilliantly, and it built into the main event where, to put Anderson Silva in context at the time, he was 10-0 in the UFC. He'd had some pretty dull title defenses, but he was just coming off of that win over Forrest Griffin that everyone loves. So that momentum was still kind of on his side when he stepped into face Damian Maia, who was a replacement opponent after Vitor Belfort pulled out and Chael Sonnen couldn't make the fight in time. So he stepped in. I mean, to tell you how bad this fight is, Bleacher Report wrote an article at the time where they said that Anderson Silva is bad for the sport of MMA because of how dominant he is. That's how bad this fight was, that people questioned whether Anderson Silva was bad for the sport as a whole. For the first two rounds, though, it's quite an entertaining fight. It's very one-sided. Anderson basically just toys with him from the off, and it is crazy how one-sided a title fight it is. Probably those first two rounds, it's one of the most dominant performances I've seen in a title fight. The problem is that after seemingly doing what he wants for two rounds, Anderson Silva just decides to coast for the other three, to the point where I'm convinced he was in his own head about something, or he was tired, because he's not even really taunting for most of it. Most of it, he's just stood there not doing anything. The crowd goes from chanting for Anderson at the end of the second round, to chanting for Damian Maia by the third, because he's the only one doing anything, to chanting for GSP, who was sat there at the event. I mean, Dana didn't put the belt on Anderson at the end of the fight, and even said that he went as far to say that if Anderson carried on performing like this, then he would cut him from the UFC, which is crazy to imagine that happening. But yeah, it's a terrible fight that I'm annoyed I rewatched. But I don't know if this is as bad as the others because of the performance from Anderson Silva in the first two rounds. Is it one of the most frustrating fights to watch in UFC history? Yes, because you've seen what Anderson can do. You know that he could probably get Damian Maia out of there, but he's not doing it. And Damian Maia really has nothing to offer Anderson Silva in the fight. He can't take him down because his wrestling is not good enough, and he doesn't want to strike because if he does, Anderson's going to pick him apart. So it's a terrible fight. Is it up there with these others as the worst title fights in UFC history? I wouldn't say it is, because Anderson does put on a clinic for the first 2 rounds. He just decides to do nothing else for the other 3, which makes it a very boring watch. Next up, we have Damian Maia back in another title fight. I think this was his 2nd shot at the belt after the one against Anderson Silva. He'd won 7 straight to get there. And again, same kind of issue at UFC 214 as he had back at UFC 112. He can't take his opponent down, and he can't open himself up to strikes because he doesn't want to get knocked out. So you end up with this very dull fight. Of course, it also features the champion Tyron Woodley, who was on a run of bad title fights. It was the co-main event of 3 title fights at UFC 214, placed in between Chris Cyborg winning a UFC title and John Jones versus Daniel Cormier 2. So 2 pretty big fights right there that it got caught in between. Woodley coming back off of the 2 fights with Wonderboy. And this is the one that I thought was going to rival Rose versus Esparza the most. I remember this fight being a horrible watch that really killed the energy before Jones versus Cormier 2. Because going into the fight, I thought that Tyron Woodley was going to knock out Damian Maia fairly easy and kind of regain some of the momentum that he'd lost against Wonderboy, because Damian Maia can't take Woodley down. He's too strong and too good a wrestler, and Woodley only has to catch Maia once. I mean, he landed 45 strikes, did Tyron Woodley, but most of them weren't very aggressive. Maia himself landed 23. Obviously, the big result that came out of it, yes, Tyron Woodley defended his belt, but he also lost the shot to fight GSP, which he originally was going to get. But Dana was heavily critical of Woodley after the performance and said who would want to pay money to watch him fight, and he basically said that it's great news for Michael Bisping because Woodley will no longer be fighting GSP. It's better from Maia, I would say. This fight, the Anderson Silva one, he couldn't do anything. He does push forward a lot and try and take Woodley down quite a lot and land some decent strikes. But again, the frustrating thing comes at Tyron Woodley, because if he just threw more, he would finish Maia, but he doesn't want to because he's worried about losing the fight. I mean, the boos come in from the very first round and they do not stop. This fight is absolutely terrible, and I will never watch it again. But it's not as bad as I remember it being. There is more than I thought. And substantially more output than the next 2 fights we're going to talk about, one of those being Namajunas versus Esparza 2. But it's definitely up there. I think it's definitely in the top 3 still. The final card that I went back and rewatched, obviously I did go back and rewatch Namajunas versus Esparza 2 again as well. But the final one I went back for was Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero at UFC 248. I watched this one live, obviously, and haven't rewatched it since watching it again the other day. I forgot maybe it's the biggest momentum shift in UFC history, going from Drakkar Klose versus Beneil Dariush, what an incredible fight that was, into Weili Zhang versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk in the co-main event, probably the fight of the year, and then Adesanya versus Romero as the main event, where not a lot happens. So it was Izzy's first title defense after beating Robert Whittaker, so much momentum on his side. This was a big shot for him, and he got so much respect and credibility for this one because he didn't need to fight Yoel Romero, and he asked for him. I mean, afterwards Dana said they probably shouldn't have made it, but Izzy got what he wanted. Yoel Romero makes these fights very strange. Because he kind of doesn't do anything. It's a bit like, it reminds me of Nick Diaz versus Anderson Silva, where Silva is trying to figure out what Diaz is doing so he can counter him, and Diaz doesn't want to give him anything. So they end up just staring at each other for a lot of it. Like, Yoel is playing games, and Izzy can't afford to play those games. But Yoel isn't giving him anything to go off. And so it's just kind of a stalemate. I mean, in the first round, Izzy overextends. I think it was a right hook. No, left. And he sort of steps in too far, and Yoel explodes and catches him with an overhand that swells up Izzy's eye. I think he catches him again in that round or in the second and chases after him. And from that point on, Adesanya's just like, well, I'm not going to engage then, because he's not going to. And if I do, I'm putting myself at risk. So he just picks him off from the outside. And, I mean, I think that it's a terrible fight that you should never watch. But it's a smart performance from Adesanya of how to win that fight without taking a risk after those first 2 rounds, which he probably loses. And it's quite relatable to the Namajunas versus Esparza one, I think. I think Rose, in a similar way to how Izzy was so cautious of Yoel exploding, Rose was so cautious of Esparza getting her down that she didn't want to commit to anything. But what Izzy showed is how you can stay away from engaging and stay smart, but still, you know, do enough to win the round and land enough significant strikes, which Rose Namajunas didn't do, despite the fact that I thought that she defended the takedowns very well from Carla Esparza. I just feel like if she'd thrown a few more jabs, a few more leg kicks each round, then that would have been her fight. But yeah, Romero versus Adesanya is probably the most comparable fight to Namajunas versus Esparza 2, with the lack of output making it quite difficult to judge some of the rounds. But after watching UFC 248 back, I realised how easy it is to judge compared to Namajunas versus Esparza. There are things that happen in the rounds, whereas Namajunas versus Esparza 2 was very much like there's one thing that happened in the round, and that's all you've got to go on. So, after watching them back, I don't think it's recency bias. I think Namajunas versus Esparza 2 is the worst title fight in UFC history. I mean, time will tell, but also I'm not going to go back and watch it ever again, so I think that's kind of solidified it in my head as the worst title fight. Let me know in the comments if you guys have any other suggestions. Maybe if there's enough suggestions of title fights that you think might be worse or at least up there with these other ones I went back and watched, maybe I'll do a part 2, but you know, I'm not looking forward to it, I'll say that. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe, because I should be putting more videos out here on this channel. But hey, hopefully this makes up for it, because you don't want to go watch these fights back, so I did to save you the time. I'll catch you on the next one, guys, in a bit.